Okay, so in this discussion, we are going to discuss absolute value and the real number line. In previous discussions, we've already seen the algebraic and order properties of the set of real numbers. This time, we're going to give our set a geometry or a topology. When you say a topology, it gives you a geometrical property of the set. Yan. So nagkakaroon na tayo ng concept ng distance. So that's what we mean by the topology. Today, we are going to define what we mean by absolute value of real number and discuss its geometric properties with respect to the set of real numbers. So we're also going to discuss intervals of real numbers. Okay, so if you're ready, let's start. We begin by the definition. We're already familiar with the definition of the absolute value. So the absolute value of a non-zero real number is simply whichever is the positive with the values A or negative A. By trichotomy, we know that a real number is either positive, zero, or negative. So either A is positive or A is zero or the negative A is the positive value. So whichever is the positive value of the two between A or negative A, that will be the value or the absolute value. Now, if the real number is zero, of course, we define it to be zero. So mathematically, we write the absolute value as follow. Yan, so nilalagay mo lang siya sa dalawang bar. Vertical bar. So the absolute value of A is equal to A if A is positive. So we have three cases by trichotomy. If A is 0, then the absolute value is 0. And if A is less than 0, meaning negative A is positive. So we choose the value of negative A. So it's either positive or 0. So let's put that as a remark. For any real number A, the absolute value is always greater than or equal to 0. Specifically, the absolute value of A is 0 if and only if, of course, A is 0. That's the only case when A is, when the absolute value is 0. Otherwise, it's always positive. Also, it is easy to show that the absolute value of negative A is the same as the absolute value of A. By definition, ang absolute value ng negative A will be negative A kung yun yung positive or A kung kung A yung positive. So we have the same values. So negative A when you get the absolute value is the same as the absolute value of A. Again, you just get whichever is positive between A and negative A. Simple example. For example, the absolute value of 7. Since 7 is positive, so we take 7. The absolute value of negative 8. Since negative 8 is negative or less than 0, so we take the negative of negative 8, which gives us 8. And we know that this is the same as the absolute value of 8. That's the same for 7. This is the same as the absolute value of negative 7. Okay? So again, we're already familiar with the definition of absolute value. Now, let's talk about the properties of absolute value. When we operate terms containing absolute value, what are the rules that we use? The product of the absolute value is the absolute value of the product. So when you have A times B, then you get the absolute value. That's the same as getting the absolute value of A, then multiply it with the absolute value of B for all real number A and B. So this is really easy to prove. We just have to take in consideration the cases when A is positive and when A is negative, and when B is positive and when B is negative. Of course, the case when A or B is 0 is easy to show. So if A is equal to 0 or if B is equal to 0, the equality holds. Right? Because both of them contains the factor A. So once one of the factor is 0, then the whole expression becomes 0 equals 0. Magiging 0 equals 0 lang yan which is true. So either when A is 0 or when B is 0, we have equality. So we're done with that case. So now what if none of them is 0? Okay, so we're looking at the case when A is not equal to 0 and when B is not equal to 0. By trichotomy again, A has two possible scenario. A is less than 0 or greater than 0. And B as well. B is either greater than 0 or less than 0. By principle of counting, there are four cases, right? Two cases each for A and two cases each for B. So we have 2 squared or 4 cases. Okay, so we have the case for the first case, we have A greater than 0, right? And so let me put B greater than 0. So that's our first case. So what happens if A is both positive? A and B are both positive. Okay. So by definition of positive numbers, A times B must be positive as well, right? Kasi we have two positive numbers. So A and B, when you multiply them, that's still a positive number. Again, that's definition of positive number. So if you remember the definition. Okay, now applying the definition of the absolute value, A is positive. So the absolute value of A is A. B is also positive. So the absolute value of B is also B. AB is positive. So the absolute value of AB is AB. Because all of them are positive. So that's definition of the absolute value. So now we can look at the expression that we want to prove. We want to say that the absolute value of AB is the same as the right-hand side. So the absolute value of AB in this case is equal to A times B. But A times B is the same as the absolute value of A because of this expression and absolute value of B because of this expression. This is a simple substitution. Tama? We just substitute equal values. Well, actually, that's the property of, that's transitive property of equality. Or also known as substitution. We just substitute equivalent values. Okay. So we were able to show that the left-hand side is equal to the right-hand side. So we're done with this case. Now, let's look at the second case. It's also possible that A is greater than 0 and B is less than 0. Okay, so that's the second case. Again, we have four cases. Ha? Let me write the cases, baka nakalimutan na. A is positive, B is positive. So that's the first case. The second case, A is positive and B is negative. The third case will be A is negative and B is positive. And the last case will be A is negative and B is negative. So all in all, that's four cases. So we're at the second case. Now, we use the same concept or the same technique. We evaluate what's AB and then we evaluate the absolute value. Now, A is positive or is greater than 0 and B is negative. So, if we multiply B on the expression by the property of inequality, remember, we can multiply a constant value on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side. So, AB will be, since this is negative, the operation will be reversed. This will become 0, less than 0 times B. Well, that is still 0, right? So, let me write just 0. So, again, that's property, multiplication property of inequality. You still remember the addition property, the multiplication property, and the transitive property of inequality. So what does that mean? AB is negative. So now we can evaluate the absolute value of A, the absolute value of B, and the absolute value of AV. So since A is positive, this is A. Since B is negative, this is negative B. And since AB is negative, then this is negative AB. That's definition of the absolute value. And now we can evaluate what's absolute value of AB. Absolute value of AB, from here, that's negative A times B. But of course, we can rewrite this as A times negative of B by the algebraic properties of real numbers, if you still remember our discussion about algebraic properties. So now A is simply absolute value of A, and then negative B is absolute value of B. So again, that's just substitution. Substitution. All right. So we can conclude in this case that the absolute value of AB is A absolute value times absolute value of B. So we're done with this case. We repeat this method for the two other cases. So we have A is less than 0 and B is greater than 0. So that means AB, by the same concept, this time we're applying it on B less than 0. Greater than 0 rather. So if A is less than 0, if I multiply B both sides, I get AB is less than 0. It remains less than since B is positive. Right? So that's the other multiplication property of inequality. So we can now evaluate the absolute value. Absolute value of A is negative A since A is negative. Absolute value of B is B. And absolute value of AB, since AB is negative, will be negative AB. Again, that's definition of the absolute value. Now, we have the equality. Absolute value of AB is equal to, well, it's negative AB. From here, it's negative AB. But negative A is absolute value of A. And of course, B is absolute value of B by substitution. Therefore, we have the equality. Absolute value of AB is equal to absolute value of A times absolute value of B. And then the last case, absolute value of A is less than 0 and A is less than 0 and B is less than 0. So we have AB. So since A is negative and B is negative, then negative A is positive and negative B is positive. So what we have here is that AB, which is the same as negative A times negative B. Now this time these are both positive numbers. That's from algebraic property of real numbers. So we have AB to be positive. Okay. So since AB is positive, A is negative, B is negative, then we have absolute value of A to be negative A, absolute value of B to be negative B, and absolute value of AB is simply AB. So this is property of the positive number. Of course, you can also use, by the way, you can also use still property of inequality. Kasi di ba A is less than 0 pa rin naman. So if I multiply B both side, since B is negative, mababaligtad yung inequality. You still have the same result. Okay? Either you use property of the positive number or property of inequality, pareho lang. It's up to you which one you want to use. Okay. So by simple substitution again, by the way, this is definition of absolute value. So by simple substitution again, we have absolute value of A and B is equal to AB. But again, by property that we've established a while ago, this is the same as negative A times negative B. But negative A is the absolute value of A and negative B is the absolute value of B by substitution. And so we're done. Since we were able to show that this absolute value of AB is the same as the absolute value of A times the absolute value of B. Since we've already exhausted all possible cases, then it is true that in all real numbers AB, equality holds. Okay? Yan. So, in-exhaust lang natin yung lahat ng possibility. Next property, the absolute value of A when you square that is the same as just simply the absolute value of A squared. For example, if you have negative 7 and you get the absolute value, then you squared. That's the same as 7 squared or 49. But if you don't put it in absolute value, negative 7 squared, that's still negative 7 times negative 7, still 49. So, pareho lang. Whether it's positive or negative. Pareho lang din yan sa 7 squared, which is the same as absolute value of 7 squared. Okay? So, if you're squaring a real number, then it doesn't matter whether that number has an absolute value of have an absolute value or not. They still have the same value. Okay, so that's easy to prove. We already know that a squared is greater than or equal to 0. That's from our discussion of inequality. When we're trying to prove that any real number at the set of natural numbers positive. So if you recall that, so we've shown there that for any real number not equal to 0, it's always true that a squared is greater than 0. Yan. A squared is greater than 0. But if a is equal to 0, then a squared is equal to 0. That's why if a squared is always greater than or equal to 0. Well, if that is the case, then a squared is positive. So that means the absolute value of a squared must be equal to a squared. Right? Kasi positive siya eh, yung a squared. But, by definition, yung nasa loob ng absolute value, itong nasa loob na to, this is actually a times a. Right? The absolute value of a. Yeah. The absolute value of a squared is absolute value of a times a. Now, from number 1, we already know that this is the absolute value of a times absolute value of a, which is the same as getting the squared of the absolute value. We started with the fact that this is equal to a squared, and we get the last part of the equation. So, therefore, absolute value of a squared is equal to a squared. Yeah. Okay? Okay, so let's have another property. If c is greater than 0, so this is how you evaluate an absolute value or an inequality with absolute value. The absolute value of a is less than or equal to c if and only if a is between negative c to c. So yan yung ginagamit natin na rule nung algebra. When you get the absolute value of an expression less than or equal to a constant number, then that expression without the absolute value is in between negative c and c. Yan. So this is an if and only if statement. So we need to prove two things. The necessary condition and the sufficient condition. So the if then muna, the if then condition. Alin yung if then? So we assume this is true, then we showed that this is true. Okay? So we're going to assume that absolute value of A is less than or equal to C. So suppose the absolute value of A is less than or equal to C. Okay. So again, when we're trying to solve absolute value, it all boils down into cases. Kasi kailangan mo lang namang i-separate yung case when the expression inside the absolute value is either positive 0 or negative. By the way, by convention, sinasama natin yung case na 0 doon sa greater than or equal. Para dalawang case na lang yung tinitingnan. Well, para walang naman ibig sabihin nun, di ba? So let's take the case when A is greater than or equal to 0. So what happens when A is greater than or equal to 0? Of course, that would mean that the absolute value of A is simply A. That's the definition, right? But from the given, absolute value of A is less than C. So by substitution or the transitive property of equality, we can replace that by simply A. So A is less than or equal to C. So we're already done with this part of the inequality. So now all we need to deal with is this part of the inequality. But we know that, of course, negative C definitely is less than or equal to 0, right? Because that's a negative number. That's a negative number because C is positive. That's why we know that negative C is negative. All right. So it's less than or equal to 0. But from the given, A is greater than or equal to 0. So meaning we have 0 to be less than or equal to A. But A is less than or equal to C. Therefore, we have the inequality negative C is less than or equal to A, less than or equal to C. So in this case, we are done. If A is greater than or equal to 0. So what if A is less than 0? So rule of exhaustion ang ginagamit natin, ha? If you remember rule of exhaustion, ibig sabihin i-exhaust mo lang lahat ng possible scenario. Now, if A is less than 0, then when evaluate the absolute value of A, we get negative A. Okay, so if we have absolute value of A to be negative A, again, substituting that in this expression, then we will have definitely negative A to be less than or equal to C. Well, we can rewrite that as, that's the same as negative C. We transpose negative C on the other side, and then we transpose A on the other side, less than or equal to A. Negative C is less than or equal to A. So we're already done with this part, yung left side. Right? So now we just have to deal with the other side. Similarly as what we've observed a while ago, so again, negative C is less than or equal to A, but A is, remember, A is negative. So this is less than 0. But 0 is always less than C because C is positive. So we have the following inequality. Negative C is less than or equal to, this is C is less than or equal to 0. 0 is less than or equal to C. So negative C is less than or equal to A. And we will remove 0 in the inequality. This is less than or equal to C. Alright? So in this case, if we assume that absolute value of A is less than or equal to C, in either case, when A is positive or when A is 0 and, or when A is less than 0, we always get the same inequality. So we're done with the necessary condition, the if-then condition. Okay. So now let's look at the sufficient condition, the other implication, yung pabaligtad naman. So in the sufficient condition, ang kailangan nating i-assume ay yung ito i-assume natin kasi papakita natin na ito yung mangyayari. Okay? So we're assuming that A is between negative C to C. So suppose negative negative C is less than or equal to A, less than or equal to C. Now again, we're dealing with absolute value, so we're going to take in consideration each case for A. What we want to show is that the absolute value of A is less than or equal to C. Okay? So cases again for A to be greater than or equal to 0, what will happen or what can we conclude? We can conclude that the absolute value of A is A. But since A is less than C, by substitution, this will imply that the absolute value of A is less than or equal to C. So we're done with that case. How about the other case? How about when A is less than 0? So when A is less than 0, we define the absolute value of A to be negative of A. Negative of A. Now, since negative C is less than or equal to A, right? Negative C is less than or equal to A. We can substitute A with negative absolute value, right? So negative C becomes less than or equal to the negative of absolute value of A because absolute value of A is negative A. So yung A doon na part, ililipat may negative sa kabila, magiging negative absolute value of A. So we have this expression. But of course, this expression can be simplified. Yung C lilipat mo doon, yung A lilipat mo doon. So we have absolute value of A less than or equal to C, which is what we want to show. So in both cases, the inequality holds, therefore we are done. Yeah. Tapos na. Napakita natin yung both inequality, the necessary and the sufficient condition. In another example or another property, if you have the absolute value of negative absolute value of A and absolute value of A is always in between. For example, let me illustrate. 7. The absolute value of 7 is 7. The negative absolute value of 7 is negative 7. Right? So this is 7, this is 7, this is negative 7. So the inequality is true. Actually, we have equality on the right. Okay? What if we're given with negative 7? What if A is negative 7? So negative 7. So the absolute value of negative 7 and the negative of the negative absolute value of negative 7 is, this is 7, this is negative 7. So negative 7 is indeed in between negative 7 and 7. Okay? So that's what the inequality means. But this is already immediate from number 2. Ano ba sabi ni number 2? Sabi ni number 2, yung absolute value ng A is less than or equal to C if and only if A is between negative C to C. So by taking as C, so we take C equals absolute value of A in saan? In 2. So ipapalit mo ng absolute value ng A yung 2. O di anong ibig sabihin nun? So ibig sabihin nun, A is between, by conclusion na C, di ba? Doon sa C ang nilagay natin, A is between negative C to C. Papalitan natin yung C ng absolute value. So this becomes absolute value of A, negative absolute value of A. Bakit pwede mong gamitin yon? Kasi ang requirement lang naman sa C, C must be greater than or equal to 0. Ang absolute value of A, that's greater than or equal to 0. So you can use that instead of C. Okay? Yan. So there are more properties of the absolute value, but we're already familiar with them. So whenever a certain property of absolute value arises, all you need to do is to prove them before using them. And that can easily be handled by these properties. Yeah. But a more interesting property in real numbers is the triangle inequality involving absolute value, is the triangle inequality. Now, it's called triangle inequality because it can be likened to a triangle. So, the absolute value of A plus B is less than or equal to the absolute value of A plus the absolute value of B. So, the concept is, if you have a triangle, so dito nang galing yung name na triangle inequality. Whenever you have a triangle kasi, this is always true. If you get the sum of A and B, that's always less than the third side C. Always greater than, sorry. The sum of the two sides of the triangle is always longer than the third side. Kahit na yung third side yung longest pa rin. If you imagine, pag in-stretch mo yung A, tsaka yung B, yan, laging mas mahaba yung dalawa kaysa sa C lang. Why? Kasi pag mas maigsi yung A and B, di ba? Hindi aabot para maging triangle. You cannot form a triangle pag mas maigsi yung dalawang side. So dapat yung combination ng dalawang side always longer than the third side para magka-triangle ka. Hindi pwedeng equal. Pag equal, yung triangle mo magiging abot-abot lang, ganun lang. Hindi ka magiging triangle. So para maging triangle, dapat yung isa maging mas mahaba yung dalawa kaysa dun sa pangatlo. Okay? So yung dalawa ay mas mahaba kaysa dun sa isang absolute value. Alright? So that's the idea or the wisdom behind the name triangle inequality. It is likened to a triangle. So that's a property of triangle ha. Huwag niyo kakalimutan yung property ng triangle na yan. The sum of the two sides, any two side for that matter, is always longer than the third side. Even if the third side is the longest of all sides. O, kahit na sa right triangle, ganun pa din yun. Pag inad mo to, laging mas mahaba yan kaysa sa C. Lagi yan. Okay. So let's prove that. Well, actually, it's easy to prove. At this point, lagi ko na sinasabi yung that's easy to prove. No? Technically speaking naman kasi, ang kailangan mo lang naman, matandaan yung mga previous theorem na pinag-uusapan natin. Yan. So once natandaan mo na siya, the next step is to know how to apply it. Okay. So medyo tricky in a way kasi hindi mo alam kung saan ka magsisimula eh. So here is where we can start from the property. From number 3 of the previous theorem, we know that the negative absolute value of A is less than or equal to A, less than or equal to absolute value of A. Now, bakit ko kinuha yung property na to? Because I have here an absolute value. So, ibig sabihin, doon ka kukuha ng expression sa may absolute value. So, this is from 3. Similarly, B is between negative absolute value of B, absolute value of B. Again, we're applying 3. Alright. Now, the trick part is to add them. Yan. So, if we add them, what we get is, so after adding them, so you add, so let me write this one below so that we can easily see kung alin yung magkakatapat. So all we need to do is to add them. So if we add them, we have the negative of the absolute value of A plus the absolute value of B. So I just group them since both of them is negative. That's less than or equal to A plus B. That's less than or equal to the absolute value of A plus the absolute value of B. So take a look at the parentheses. Absolute value of A plus B. Absolute value of A plus B. One is positive, one has negative symbol. Right? Can you remember that form? That's the same as this one. C, negative C, somewhere in between. That's the same as this one. So that somewhere in between is squeezed in the absolute value. Right? So that means we can rewrite this in terms of our absolute value. So that means we have, if we follow the pattern of number 2, so we have the absolute value of somewhere in between, absolute value of A plus B is less than or equal this common value here. So absolute value of A plus absolute value of B, which is exactly what we want to show. So we are done. Okay. There are variation of the triangle inequality. Let me show you two variation. This is one variation. The absolute value of quantity, absolute value of A minus absolute value of B is less than or equal to absolute value of A minus B. That's a variation of this triangle inequality. Another variation is this one. The absolute value of A minus B is less than or equal to absolute value of A plus absolute value of B. Okay? So, let's prove the two variation. Ibig sabihin, galing lang din siya sa triangle inequality. Kaya siya tinawag na variation. So, kung galing lang siya sa triangle inequality, ibig sabihin, gagamitin lang natin triangle inequality to prove it. Medyo tricky lang. Okay, so ito ulit yung trick. Meron tayong A minus B. So, we need to introduce A minus B in the triangle inequality para magamit natin triangle inequality. And this is the trick to use that. CA, you can write that as A minus B plus B. Medyo mahirap siyang isipin. Medyo tricky talaga siya kasi paano mo maiisip na express yung A sa ganyan, di ba? So that's the tricky part. The rest is easy. Just apply triangle inequality. Okay. So anong makukuha mo from this one? Absolute value of A is equal to absolute value of A minus B plus B. Now, I intentionally group A minus B para makita mo siya as dalawang term lang. First term plus second term. Ano sabi ng triangle inequality? If you have two terms inside the absolute value, whatever the terms inside the absolute value, first term plus last term, pwede mo siya lang i-absolute individually. I-absolute value ko siya individually ha. So this becomes less than or equal to the absolute value of A minus B plus the absolute value of B. Yun yung trick part. Naipasok natin yung A minus B sa absolute value. Right? Tama, di ba? Okay. So, pwede mo na i-transpose. So, meron ka na absolute value of A. Pwede mo na i-transpose yung B sa kabila. So, you have absolute value of A minus absolute value of B is less than or equal to absolute value of A plus absolute value of B. Sa B naman. So, B, at the moment, isa pa lang yung napoprove natin kasi ito may absolute value ito eh. Tama? Ito walang absolute value. So, kailangan ipakita natin yung isa pa. Okay. B is the same as, kamukha nung ginawa natin kanina, B minus A plus A. So, if we get the absolute value, that's equal to the absolute value of B minus A plus A. So, again, we're grouping B minus A. Ayan. So, this is less than or equal to the absolute value of B minus A plus the absolute value of A. Similarly, you can transpose A and you'll end up with absolute value of B minus absolute value of A to be less than or equal to absolute value of B minus A. Yan. Okay. Now, this is B minus A pero yung given natin A minus B. But of course, sabi nga natin kanina, di ba? Yung absolute value ng negative x is the same as the absolute value of x. So, if I multiply it by negative 1, it will become A minus B. So, yung B minus A, pareho lang sa absolute value ng A minus B. So, this is absolute value of B minus A. But this is absolute value of A minus absolute value of B. So, ganyan ulit. Ililipat ko siya sa kabila. Tapos ito, ililipat ko sa kabila. So, ito, transpose ko sa kabila. Ito, transpose ko sa left. So, it will become negative absolute value of A minus B is less than or equal to absolute value of A minus B. Mababaliktad yung sign. Para magkamukha na sila nito. So, ito na yung common. Tapos, nasa gitna siya nito. Wait, this is a wrong expression. Wrong expression, sorry. It should be this one, di ba? A minus B. Yan. Okay. So, ulitin natin. So, ito, nasa gitna. Nasa kanan niya to, nasa kaliwa niya may negative. Sounds familiar? Yan na yung number 2, di ba? Ibig sabihin, anong pakita natin? Negative absolute value ng A minus B is less than or equal to absolute value of A minus absolute value of B less than or equal to, from this one, absolute value of A minus B. So, nakaipit to sa gitna nung negative nito tsaka positive nito. So, by number 2, we have Yung absolute value ng nasa gitna is less than or equal doon sa nasa kanan, A minus B. But that's what we want to show. Alright, so we are done. Okay, next. The absolute value of A minus B is less than or equal to the absolute value of A plus absolute value of B. Well, this is easy application of inequality, triangle inequality. Lalagay mo lang, A minus B is equal to, by definition of A minus B, A plus the negative of B. But by triangle inequality, this is less than or equal to A plus absolute value of negative B. Again, absolute value of negative B is the same as absolute value of B. So this one is less than or equal to this one. Therefore, A minus B is less than or equal to A plus absolute value of B. Alright? Now, let's use that in our example. No, ito, familiar na kayo dito. Ito na yung ginagawa ninyo nung algebra. So, we're now just applying the property. Okay. So, from algebra, from our previous discussion, that's theorem number 2, right? Yung pangalawa dun sa theorem. This can be written as if and only if yung 11 magiging negative sa left side. So, negative 11 less than, para mawala ni absolute value, 11. So, this is our rule on removing the absolute value. So, by addition property, we can add negative 5 both sides. So, plus negative 5, plus negative 5, plus negative 5. So, we have, so again, that's addition property of inequality yung gagamitin. So, negative 16 is less than 2x is less than 11 minus 5, 6. So, gumamit tayo ng addition property of inequality. Dito, ang ginamit natin, yung theorem. Property of absolute value. Okay. So, again, we can use this time multiplication property, right? You can multiply by 1/2, multiply by 1/2, multiply by 1/2. So, multiply everything by 1/2. So, you have negative 8 less than, what's 1/2 times x? Eh, di x na lang. 6 times 1/2, 3 na lang. So, this time, that's the multiplication property of inequality. So, we were able to solve the solution set. The solution set is equal to all real number x in the set of real numbers such that x is between negative 8 to 3. Well, in our notation of open interval, that's also can be written as negative 8, 3. Yan, in open interval notation. Okay, sige. Let's have another example. So what if we have two absolute value? So again, this is just application of definition of absolute value. So when you have an absolute value, you need to determine when your absolute value will become positive, will become zero. So how do you know when will it be positive, when will it be negative? On the values of the what's ever inside the absolute value. So on the values of x and on the values of x minus 2. Right? So kailan ba siya magsisiro? Yung x magsisiro sa 0. Yung x minus 2 sa 2. So we can imagine this as in the number line, this is 0, this is 2. So we have three cases. When x is less than 0, when x is between 0 to 2. So lagay natin yung equal 0 sa x sa kabila. And when x is greater than or equal to 2. So all in all, you have three cases. So, 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 all in all, every time you have an absolute value, you just have to evaluate them on cases where the absolute value is either positive or negative. Yung zero, kahit saan mo ilagay, okay lang yun. It doesn't matter. Kasi when x is zero, de zero lang yung value ng absolute value. Okay? So, three cases. If x is less than zero, what will happen? So, now you can evaluate yung absolute value mo since you have an interval for x. So, what will happen if x is less than zero? So, since x is less than zero, the absolute value becomes negative x. Now, this time, when x is zero, or when x is less than zero rather, and then you subtract it by 2, it becomes even more negative, di ba? Parang dinagdagan mo yung pagka-negative niya. So, that's still a negative. So, the absolute value of that will be negative of x minus 2. Right? Which we can solve easily as, so that's negative x is less than or equal to negative x plus 2. Which means that when I transpose, right? When I transpose yung x, I have 0, 0 is less than or equal to 2. Which is always true. So meaning, any value if x is less than 0, the inequality or the absolute value is always true. So ano solution set dito? From this case, x is less than 0. Yan. Or in our interval, wag na natin interval notation. Okay, next. What if x is between 0 to 2? So what will happen to the absolute value? Now, the absolute value of x for any value between 0 to 2 is positive. So that means if you get the absolute value of x, you'll just have x. On the other hand, when x is less than 2, for example, you can get a representative value, let's say 1. 1 minus 2 is negative. So any values inside the absolute value is negative. So when you get the absolute value, that's negative of whatever inside. So negative x minus 2. So that means we have x is less than or equal to negative x plus 2. Or you can easily compute that as 2x is less than or equal to 2. Or that means that x is less than or equal to 1. But remember, we are in the case when x is between 0 to 2. So, alin lang kukunin mo? So, the solution set is all values between 0 to 2 such that x is less than 1. So, x is in R such that x is between 0 up to, so are we including 2? Less than or equal? Yes. So, hanggang 1. So, 0 to 1 lang. Again, because we're in the case of values of x between 0 to 2. So, between 0 to 2, ang kukunin mo lang yung solution set na x less than 1. Okay, last case, if x is greater than or equal to 2, what will happen? So, if x is greater than or equal to 2, absolute value of x is positive. So, I simply get x. Now, x minus 2, if x is greater than 2, is positive as well. For example, what is greater than 2? So, let's say 3. 3 minus 2 is 1, which is positive. So, anything inside is positive. So, the absolute value is just x minus 2. But this is the same as 0 is less than or equal to negative 2. Well, that's always false. Diba? Mali yan eh. So, kung false yun, ano solution set doon? O, de empty. Kasi no x satisfy the inequality. So the solution set for all will be just the collection of all the solution set. All x element of R such that, so kukunin mo lang yung union. So union ng tatlo. Less than 0, between 0 to 1, tsaka empty. So the union is less than 1. X is less than or equal to 1. Tama? Okay. Let's have another example. Let's say we have the function f of x equals 2x squared plus 3x plus 5 all over 3x minus 1. So we want to find a constant m such that f of x is less than or equal to m for all x satisfying x between 2 to 5. So we just want to find a value m. Kahit anong value. Basta sigurado tayo ng f of x, pag in absolute value mo, always less than. Okay. So this time, ang hinahanap natin yung mga values or specific values ng m. Now, what can we say about our function? Our function is defined using the rational expression. The numerator is 2x squared plus 3x plus 5. So by using the triangle inequality, we know that this is less than or equal to absolute value ng each term. So 2x squared plus 3x plus 5. I already evaluated absolute value of 2, ha? Tsaka absolute value of 3 and absolute value of 5. But remember, x is between 2 to 5. Right? So x is between 2 to 5. Now, what we want is a value m such that f of x is less than. So meaning, we need to be able to determine what's the highest possible value for the numerator. Because that will be the highest possible, that will give you the highest possible value for your function. If you know the highest possible value of the numerator. So when will we attain the highest possible value of numerator? Pagka ang x nasa 2 o ang x nasa 5. So let's take a look. This is all sum. So additive yung operation. So mas malaki yung x, mas malaki yung value, right? So that means ang kailangan nating value yung 5. So ibig sabihin, ang pinakamalaki ng possible value na expression ay 2 times 5 squared plus 3 times 5 plus 5. Wala nang mas lalaki pang value dyan. Right? Kasi ang pinakamalaking value ng x ay 5. Pag pinalit mo yung x, delete yung value ng numerator. Okay? And that's equal to 70. So ang numerator, ang highest possible value, 70. Right? Okay, how about the denominator? Let's look at the denominator. Now, 3x minus 1 is in the denominator. So if it's in the denominator, ano gusto natin sa kanya? Ayaw natin siyang lumiit. Why? Because the smaller the denominator, the bigger the number is, di ba? So ang x, di ba, kung ano man yung numerator mo? The numerator over 3, saka numerator over 7. Alin ang mas malaking value? Siyempre, mas malaki yung n over 3. Kasi mas maliit yung numerator niya eh. Ayan, inversely proportional, di ba? So what we want for the numerator is to be as small as possible. As small as possible. So ano ba yung mga pinakamaliit na pwedeng value ni denominator? Okay. Since this is minus, ang gagamitin natin, syempre, yung property na involved yung minus. So this is greater than or equal to absolute value ng 3x minus absolute value ng 1. Right? Okay. So yan yung property ng triangle inequality, ha? Okay. But ano ba yung pinakamaliit ng value ng x? Now, we want this to be as small as possible. So, kailan to liliit? Pag pinalit mo yung x. So, as small as possible. So, pag ang x ay 2. So, this is as small as possible when x is 2. So, 3 times 2 minus 1, which is 5. So, that means our function, when you get the absolute value, is as large as possible when the numerator is the largest and when the denominator is the smallest. The largest possible value for the numerator is 70 and the smallest possible value for the denominator is 5. So that means f of x is less than or equal to 70 over 5, which is 14. So ito yung hinahanap nating m. Of course, any value greater than 14 will still suffice. Pero syempre, paano natin na-figure out na yung 14 ay isang value for m? Yan. We use the property of inequality. So a while ago, I said that this absolute value gives a geometry to the set of real numbers. Now, this gives the concept of distance. Absolute value can be visualized actually as the distance of the number a from 0. So for example, this is a. So you get the absolute value. Actually, what you're getting is the distance between 0 and a. So when you say the absolute value of negative 7, meaning negative 7 is 7 units away from 0. So if you have, let's say, negative 7 here, the absolute value of negative 7 is 7, meaning from end to end, negative 7 to 0, that's 7 units. So that's the distance of any number a from 0. In general, if you want the distance between any number a and b, all you need to do is to get the absolute value of a minus b. So that's the distance between a and b. Or b minus a for that matter, pareho lang ha. They are equal naman, di ba? B minus a is equal to a minus b. So the distance between two numbers is given by absolute value of a minus b. Okay, so nagkaroon na tayo ng concept ng distance. So now, we can determine whether two numbers are apart, wide apart, or near each other. Hence, we know what we call a topology. So meron na tayong concept ng measures of distance. We know when an object is near and we know when an object is far. When two numbers are near together or far apart. Okay. Now, this concept of nearness, yung pagiging malapit ng dalawang number, right? For example, meron kang 0 and 1 over n. So, yung 1 over n, palapit ng palapit. As n become large, 1 over n become near. That's the concept of nearness. And that's established only because we have the concept of distance. Okay. So, the concept of nearness can be more visualized by neighborhood. So, let me define what we mean by a neighborhood. This neighborhood will be used extensively when we go to limits and derivative. So at this point, I want to reiterate already yung definition ng neighborhood para mas madali natin siyang maintindihan when we apply it in the concept of limit. We're going to apply it in the concept of limit eventually. Okay. So let A be a real number, and for any epsilon, the epsilon neighborhood of A is the set, so this is the notation, B sub epsilon of A. Now, the reason why it's called B, in two-dimensional kasi, a neighborhood is a disk. And in three-dimensional, a neighborhood is a ball. So in general, you can imagine of your neighborhood as a ball around A. So that's how you imagine. You have an A, ang neighborhood yung nakapaikot sa A. So it's like a ball around A. But since we're in two-dimensional, nasa number line pa lang tayo. But later, gagawin natin two-dimensional yan. So a ball centered at A of radius epsilon. So ball center equals A, radius equals epsilon, is defined by the set of all x in the real number such that the absolute value of x minus a is less than epsilon. Again, what do we mean by the absolute value? That's the distance between a and b. So what we're trying to say is we collect all x such that the distance from a is less than epsilon. Now, mathematically speaking, if x is in the ball, then of course, that means that this inequality is true. But from our theorem a while ago, theorem number 2, this is the same as yung naiipit ng absolute value nasa gitna ng E ng epsilon tsaka ng negative epsilon. Okay? By adding a both sides, so plus a plus a plus a, so you have a minus epsilon tsaka a plus epsilon. So how do you visualize this ball? Dali na visualize yung ball na yan. So well actually it's not yet a ball. Okay? Interval siya. So meron kang a, tapos meron kang epsilon. So what you do is you get the epsilon distance from a. So let's say from the right, kunin mo yung epsilon ang layo, that's a plus epsilon. Then on the left, you get a plus epsilon. You get all the points. So excluding a, you get all the points between negative, this should be negative, a minus epsilon. Between a minus epsilon and a plus epsilon, all of them are the neighborhood of a. I'm excluding a because in the concept of neighborhood, hindi mo kapitbahay yung sarili mo. Siyempre, ikaw yun eh. So, sino yung kapitbahay mo? Beside you. Okay. So, the neighborhood of a are all points that are less than epsilon distance from you, from a. Yun yung neighborhood ni a. Lahat ng x na ang layo from a less than epsilon. Okay? So, ganun kadaling isipin ng neighborhood. Lahat ng x na mas malapit ng epsilon kay a. Mas malapit ng epsilon, ha? Ibig sabihin, hindi ka lalagpas ng epsilon dapat. Okay, so the smaller the epsilon, of course, the smaller the neighborhood will become. The bigger the epsilon, the bigger the neighborhood will become. A certain property, if you have a number x such that kahit anong epsilon ang kunin mo, laging yung x nasa neighborhood. That only happens when x is a itself. Ibig sabihin, pag ang x hindi a, pag lumiliit ang neighborhood, nawawala yung x doon. For example, meron akong a. Tapos kumuha ako ng epsilon neighborhood. Then I choose an x. Okay. So may x doon sa epsilon neighborhood. Now, what if I make epsilon smaller? So for example, I divide epsilon by 10. So I get a smaller epsilon. So magiging epsilon over 10 neighborhood. So this epsilon over 10 neighborhood is a smaller neighborhood. So wala na si x sa kanya. X does not belong to this neighborhood. So although x belong to the ball centered at A with radius epsilon, x does not belong if we make, let's say lang na may specific epsilon na nung dinivide mo sa 10, wala na yung x. Well, you can make the denominator as large as you can until such time na si x wala na sa neighborhood. So it can happen. Every time you make your neighborhood smaller, nababawasan yung mga points. So it's possible that there's an x na nasa neighborhood nung una pero wala na eventually. Pero kung every epsilon na kunin mo, yung x na yon persistently nasa neighborhood mo. Persistently. Isa lang ang scenario na yon. Ibig sabihin, yung A mismo yon. So that's the trivial case. Okay? Well, paano mo mapapakita na something is equal? So ibig sabihin, para masabi mo ng x equals a, ang gusto mo talagang tumbukin, yung distance nila sa isa't isa, 0. So what you really want to show is that the absolute value of x minus a is 0. Right? Syempre from the given that x is in the ball, for any epsilon that you get, then ang ibig sabihin nun, si x minus a is less than epsilon for any epsilon. Now remember, yung properties natin ng 0, meron kang number na less than positive number for any positive number. If you remember that properties of 0. Meron kang isang number such that for any positive number, laging b is less than a for all a greater than 0. Ano ang conclusion natin doon? Isa lang ang conclusion niyan. B is 0. Because you cannot have any positive number na laging mas maliit sa kahit anong positive number na hinahanap natin or na gusto natin. Why? Kasi pag meron kang positive number A, hindi pwedeng si B mas maliit yan at si B ay positive din. Bakit? At some point, si B kung positive, magkakaroon siya ng difference with zero. Magkakaroon ng point in between. So magiging false yung claim na B is less than any number A. Right? So mangyayari lang yon if B itself is zero. So this can only happen if and only if B is zero. For every A, B is less than A. O di ibig sabihin nun, this is precisely this one. For any number, absolute value of something, it's always less than epsilon for any epsilon. So therefore, yung x minus A is 0. Which means x is A. Ganyan lang. Again, ang sinasabi lang nun, pag paliit ng paliit, yung neighborhood mo, nababawasan yung laman. May mga x na nawawala. So kung merong isang x na hindi nawawala, kahit anong neighborhood ang piliin mo, yung x na yon yung A lang. Yun lang yung tanging neighborhood niya. Well, technically speaking, hindi siya neighborhood. Yun lang yung tanging number na hindi nawawala doon sa inequality. Yung A lang. The rest, mawawala sa inequality. Okay? Let's have another example how to illustrate that. Let's say we have epsilon greater than 0. And delta greater than 0. So, meron tayong dalawang positive number. Tapos, let's say A is a real number. Let's show daw that show that yung ball epsilon centered at A intersection ball delta centered din at A. Yan. And ball epsilon centered at A union ball epsilon centered at A are gamma neighborhood. So they are gamma neighborhood of A for some gamma. Yan. So, ibig sabihin, dapat we can find a certain gamma such that we can express this as a single neighborhood. Well, to illustrate, dahil na ma-illustrate to. Meron ka daw A. Tapos meron kang delta tsaka epsilon. So meron kang dalawang positive number, isang delta, isang epsilon. Well, without loss of generality, sabihin natin na mas malaki yung isa sa isa. So without loss of generality, kasi kung equal yung dalawa na yan, syempre ang intersection is the same. Ang union is the same. So without loss of generality, let us assume that epsilon is greater than delta. So anong ibig sabihin ng ball centered at A? In the neighborhood, ano ibig sabihin ng epsilon neighborhood? It's an interval centered at A. Interval centered at A of radius epsilon. So kukuha ka ng epsilon distance, A plus epsilon, A minus epsilon, lahat to, yan yung epsilon neighborhood at A. Okay, ano naman yung delta neighborhood? So, since sinabi natin mas malaki si epsilon, dapat yung delta mas maliit. So, let's say this is delta. This is delta. Okay, so this is A plus delta and this is A minus delta. So, lahat ng nasa loob, yun naman yung delta neighborhood. Right? So, meron kang dalawang set. Gusto mong kunin yung intersection. Easily, the intersection of the epsilon neighborhood and the delta neighborhood will be Since subset yung isa ni isa. Di ba? So, si epsilon delta, subset niya si epsilon neighborhood, subset niya si delta neighborhood. So, sabi ng property ng intersection, pag ang A subset ni B at in-intersect mo sila, di ba? Ano ibig sabihin nun? E de yung A intersection B is simply yung mas maliit, yung A. You need to remember that's your set theory, ha? Yung mga properties sa set theory. Very important na naaalala pa yun. Okay. So, alin ang sagot dyan? Yung mas maliit. Double delta A. So, ibig sabihin here, gamma is equal to delta. Yung hinahanap mong gamma. So, this is a delta neighborhood. Well, similarly, di ba? Pwede rin naman na, pakita ulit natin yung figure. Pag union naman, similarly, pag union, so the ball epsilon A, union ball delta A, so mas malaki yung, remember, mas malaki yung A. Ano naman mangyayari sa union? If A is a subset of B, then ang A union B will be the bigger one, yung B. Yun naman ang gagamitin natin. So this is equal to the ball centered radius epsilon centered at A. So here, yung hinahanap natin ng mga gamma ay yung epsilon.